through the evening. Towards the northeast coast, there will be some murky low cloud feeding in on the onshore breeze. Further inland, things could stay fine with some sunshine lingering to end the day. 1 or 2 showers are possible for southern and southwestern parts of Scotland later. Otherwise, it will be a dry evening with variable amounts of cloud and sunny breaks. Across in Northern Ireland, it will be fine to end the day with plenty of late sunshine. The brisk breeze should have eased as well with light winds tonight. Looking ahead at the UK overnight, and any showers will die out with a touch of frost in rural northern spots. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Nana Akweer, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone. We learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's 2 questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon. You're watching the discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman. We discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. I'm joined in the studio throughout the show by James Bloodworth, journalist and author of Hired, 6 months undercover in low-wage Britain. And on the discussion today, we bring you the latest analysis on the war in Ukraine. Also, we ask whether sex education should be taught to children. And following riots in Sweden this week, we find out why this is happening. And finally, is another working class revolt brewing in response to the cost of living crisis? But first, here's the bulletins.
Good afternoon, it's 1 minute past 3. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. 3 government ministers and 2 shadow cabinet ministers have been reported to a parliamentary watchdog for allegations of sexual misconduct. That's according to the Sunday Times. It reports they're among 56 MPs who've been referred to the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. The paper says allegations range from making sexually inappropriate comments to more serious wrongdoing, with at least 1 complaint believed to be criminal. Sir Keir Starmer has criticised the Met Police for not disclosing how many fines are being issued over Downing Street parties before the local elections. The Labour leader says it's in the public interest to know. The Prime Minister has already been fined once for attending his own birthday gathering in June 2020. Brexit Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg told GB News that there's more pressing matters than talking about events from 2 years ago.
Boris Johnson got those decisions right. He delivered the vaccine. He has led the world in terms of Ukraine. He is a great leader. And I think talking about things that happened 2 years ago is not the most pressing political issue by any means.
The UK's Trade Policy Minister has told GB News there's some indication the government's new immigration deal with Rwanda is already having a deterrent effect. The government announced the £120 million deal earlier this month. It will see asylum seekers who cross the channel in small boats sent for processing in Rwanda, where they'll have the right to apply to live. Penny Mordaunt told GB News the government will be ready to adapt if people traffickers change tactics.
You announce something that's really quite groundbreaking, you are going to get a lot of criticism and a lot of scepticism. But we will see. We will see if this is going to start to work. And no doubt the people traffickers will start to adapt their business model to try and circumvent this, and we'll adapt as well.
As Ukrainians try to celebrate Orthodox Easter Sunday in the country, the governor of Luhansk says a number of civilians have been killed by Russian shelling. And in the Black Sea port Odessa, at least 8 people have been killed as 2 missiles struck 2 residential buildings. President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged his people not to lose hope and said that he still believes in the victory of Ukraine. 10 of the 26 people on board a tour boat that went missing off the coast of Japan have died. That's according to the Japanese broadcaster NHK. They were all found near the northern island of Hokkaido. 7 patrol boats, 3 aeroplanes and 4 helicopters have been searching for survivors after crew made an emergency distress call saying water was flooding into the ship. Voter turnout for the French presidential election between Macron and Le Pen stands at 26% so far today. That's 2% lower than 4 years ago, which analysts say might be down to uncertainty around who to vote for. The country will choose whether pro-European Union President Emmanuel Macron keeps his job or if the so-called far-right candidate Marine Le Pen takes the seat. Voting will close at 8 p.m. tonight. Paris-based journalist David Chazan told GB News if Macron wins, his margin of victory over Le Pen will be smaller than it was in 2017.
Whoever wins this election is going to be leading a divided country, and there's going to be a lot of very disgruntled people. And the reason that the turnout's likely to be quite low by French standards is because many voters just feel that there's neither of these candidates really represents their views. This nation is divided geographically, economically, and even by age.
A man who was arrested after a knife attack near Coventry yesterday has been detained under the Mental Health Act. Warwickshire police say the 33-year-old injured at least 10 people during the assault in Bedworth Town Centre. 3 of them suffered stab wounds. Detectives are appealing for anyone who was injured to come forward if they haven't already. And the first openly transgender MP has offered advice to young people struggling with their gender identity. Jamie Wallace told them not to wait as long as he did. The Conservative MP for Bridgend has been praised for being open about having gender dysphoria. He released a personal statement last month saying he wants to transition to be a woman. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, let's return to the discussion.
Today is day 60 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin has claimed victory over the besieged city of Mariupol, claiming to have, quote, liberated the area. Russia aims to seize southern Ukraine and to open a route to the separatist region of Transnistria in Moldova, a senior Russian general, Major General Rustin Minikeyev, has said. Ukrainian officials say Russia has, quote, acknowledged that the goal of the second phase of the war is not victory over the mythical Nazis, but simply the occupation of eastern and southern Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is planning on holding a series of sham independence referendums in occupied regions to create a series of pro-Russian breakaway states. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has suggested there is, quote, a realistic possibility the war in Ukraine could continue to the end of next year. Therefore, how long could this war continue? What are Russia's goals at this stage of the conflict? What are the options for the Ukrainian people? And what role, if any, can and should the West play right now? Well, I am joined now by Lee Jones, Professor of Political Economy and International Relations, and sociologist Frank Furedi. Thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Firstly, I'll start with you, Dr. Lee Jones. Do you agree with Boris Johnson that this war could continue to the late next year?
It could potentially go on for months or even years, it seems to me, because there are those in the West that would like to turn this into a long-term proxy war against the Russians, would like to bleed Russia for as long as possible and fight to the last Ukrainian. So instead of trying to de-escalate the war and its just, appalling impact on the Ukrainian people, clearly the message that's coming out of Washington, London and elsewhere is people are settling in for the long haul. The United States has started to transfer heavy weaponry to the Ukrainians and to deploy American trainers to train the Ukrainians in the use of these weapons. So they seem to be settling in for a very long-term conflict, which is going to have an absolutely devastating impact, I think, on the Ukrainian population, bearing in mind that a quarter of them have already been displaced by the conflict and that the Ukrainian economy is due to contract by half this year alone. And got to bear in mind also that Ukraine's GDP has still not recovered to 1990 levels. So this is a relatively poor country being completely brutalized by the appalling Russian invasion. And it seems that both sides are gearing up for a very long-term conflict, which is just an absolute tragedy.
Professor Furedi, I mean, what do you think? Some people argue that if the conflict continues, that Western resolve and moral support could begin to wane as people become disillusioned with supporting the conflict. Do you have sympathy with that argument at all? Do you think that we should be continuing to send weapons to Ukraine? Professor Furedi?
Yes, when I was in Ukraine last month, the impression I gained was that most people understand that this is going to be a very long war. They realize that conflict will not end anytime soon, and they were all desperate for far greater material support from anywhere in the world. And in a sense, what they understand is at the moment, the only people that they can really rely on are places like Poland, Slovakia, Romania, some of these countries that are in the region. And what they are really worried about is that the West is going to have a very short time span in terms of how long it will keep giving arms and how long it will maintain support. And it seems to me that one of the things that has become a problem from their perspective is that there's already signs of war weariness within the West, where a lot of people are saying it was all right to get in there and provide people with support. It looked really good when Boris Johnson went to Kiev, and it looked really good when everybody seemed to be united. But at the end of the day, this has become almost like a European version of Afghanistan, where you have this very long proxy war where people are jockeying for different kinds of positions, and where in the meantime Russia can carry on and going for the long haul, occupying the eastern part of the country, and eventually trying to sort of gain more momentum and move further to the west. And what I'm really worried about now is that unless there's something decisive taking place, that this war is going to be just protracted into the indefinite future. So we have to make sure that here in Britain, war weariness and cynicism about this conflict doesn't become the norm in the future, and that we take seriously the importance of providing solidarity with the determination of the Ukrainians to maintain their freedom.
On that point, Dr. Lee Jones, there's an article in The Observer today by Simon Tisdall, who argues that the awful truth is dawning, that Russia might win the war and that will have awful consequences and usher in a new era of instability. And therefore, in order to prevent that prospect of Russia winning the war, isn't it essential that we continue to provide military support to Ukraine to uphold, at the very least, that fundamental principle of sovereignty?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a brutal violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. And we should, of course, support the Ukrainians' right to defend themselves and to fight back against this kind of aggression. There's no doubt about that. But when organizations like NATO or the EU talk about Ukrainian sovereignty and say that this is a war for sovereignty, it's very curious, because these are organizations that are not interested in sovereignty. These organizations suppress their member states' sovereignty through transnational... May I finish my point? You have invited me on, then ask me a question. So these organizations suppress their member states' own sovereignty to the point where Britain voted to leave the European Union in order to regain its sovereignty. Ukraine's position, the Ukrainian government's position, is that it wants to join NATO and it wants to join the European Union. In other words, the Ukrainian elite's position is that they wish to sacrifice their country's sovereignty to Western international organizations. So there's what ordinary Ukrainians are doing, which is fighting for their homeland against a brutal Russian invasion. And then there's what the Ukrainian establishment seems to want to do, which is to integrate itself with the Western political establishment and their transnational organizations. So I think actually what's going on here in terms of the underlying dynamics of the war are quite different to the standard account, that this is simply straightforwardly a war for sovereignty, because it seems on the part of the Ukrainian elite at least, they're fighting to give away their sovereignty.
But Dr. Lee Jones, I guess people who would push back on that, some people would push back on that and say there are always contradictions and tensions within international conflicts, and that even if the Ukrainian political establishment eventually want to join the European Union, that is a decision that they will make as a sovereign nation. But the fundamental principle of sovereignty and their own self-determination needs to be defended. And therefore, what is the alternative option for the Ukrainian people other than to just accept Russian demands?
Well, sovereign governments have to make choices for their own people in the context of political realism. So it seems very clear to me that, in fact, NATO and the EU are not going to accept Ukraine. There has been a Ukrainian demand since the early 1990s to join NATO, and Ukraine has been angling for EU membership since the 2010s. And these organizations have basically kind of strung Ukraine along. They said, oh, maybe at some point in the future, but not now. You know, firstly, you've got to enact lots of domestic reforms. You've got to change your domestic economic regulations, your military organizations. You've got to privatize your state-owned enterprises and so on, and maybe at some point in the future. But of course, after all the devastation that's been heaped upon Ukraine by the brutal invasion of the Russians, the EU is going to be even less minded to take on Ukraine, because nobody wants to take on what is now a complete economic basket case and assume responsibility for trying to rebuild it. And NATO will not want to accept Ukraine as a member either, because there's always the risk, therefore, of a direct military confrontation with the Russians. So these organizations, in many ways, have sort of strung the Ukrainian establishment along, promising them at some point in the future, it's going to happen, even though there's very little likelihood of it happening, which has convinced them to forge a path of integration with Russia's enemies, which obviously Russia is not willing to stand for. So I think there's a series of complete strategic blunders that have been made on the part of the Western political establishment, but also the Ukrainian political leadership has pursued integration with Russia's enemies and therefore risked this invasion. If Russia had pursued a foreign policy of neutrality from the very beginning, then it would have given Vladimir Putin far less of an excuse to pursue this brutal invasion. And in the end, I think that if there's going to be a settlement of this conflict, it will involve Ukraine pursuing a foreign policy course of neutrality. The Ukrainian government has accepted that. So it's a great tragedy that this policy course was not pursued before the invasion, but only after so many people have lost their lives. As for what we should be doing in the West, we should be trying to seek a way to de-escalate this war and stop the killing, stop the bombardment of urban centres, and help people to live in peace. That should be our objective, it seems to me.
And final word to you, Professor Falarin. I mean, what's your reaction to what Dr. Lee Jones has said? I mean, isn't that a fundamental problem at the heart of it as well, that the reality of the successive failings of political elites within Western societies, perhaps making a situation like this more likely, and that is still a problem to overcome, the competing interests that are still operating amongst the Western elite in terms of Ukraine?
Well, obviously, the Western elites are not angels. And in the past, they played a very bad role in relation to this conflict. But the idea that somehow we in the West have got to de-escalate the conflict and bring about peace is weird. And it smacks of a real sensibility of appeasement, because who is doing all the escalation in the war? You know, who's invaded Ukraine? Whatever you can say about the West, they're not responsible for the bloodshed and the destruction of a nation. They weren't the ones that sent their troops into the Ukraine. Their role might not have been, sort of exemplary, and very often they made a lot of blunders and mistakes. But it seems to me that there's a real weirdness about the idea of blaming the West for something that Russia is directly responsible for, what caused all this war. I think also there's a danger of projecting, what we think ought to happen in the Ukraine onto the Ukrainian people, because it may well be the case that Dr. Jones or myself or anybody else on this show would like the Ukraine to be neutral. But it's really up to the Ukrainians to make a decision as to what kind of political constitution they have. It's up to them to decide where they stand in relation to this. And it seems to me that somehow, talking about the blunders of the elites in Kiev as being in any shape or form the key variable almost ends up being a form of victim blaming, that somehow these idiots in Kiev, if they had a PhD in international relations, they might have chosen a different path instead of blundering to this war. I think that is a little bit irresponsible, because at the end of the day, this war was, in the offing. Putin and the Russian military were very much expecting to have a very quick fix war here. They were the ones that kind of launched it. And at the moment, if you want to de-escalate the war, the best way of de-escalating the war is by providing more arms to the Ukrainians to make sure that rather than it being a protracted war that goes on until the end of next year or even longer than that, somehow Russia will come to understand that this is a very high-risk, high-cost war. And that's the only way this is going to stop. It's not going to stop by the Ukrainians rolling over and demanding peace. We're going to de-escalate. It can only stop once the Russians understand that the risk of continuing are far greater than the potential benefit.
Well, thank you both for joining me. Very multifaceted and complex discussion. Hopefully we've brought some insight into the different perspectives there over the last 10 minutes. Thank you both, Professor Frank Falarin, sociologist and social commentator, and Dr. Lee Jones, Professor of Political Economy and International Relations. I'm just going to get some quick reaction from you, James, to that very big and multifaceted discussion. I mean, what are your thoughts on some of the things that Professor Falarin was saying and also Professor Jones?
I think it's a mistake to think that Russian aggression is a consequence of NATO's behaviour or NATO expansionism. And I think there's a conflation there between the EU and NATO. I think we've left the European Union in this country, but we're still members of NATO. And we could leave NATO if we wanted to, but I don't think that's on the cards. This is why Ukraine was effectively neutral. It sought to join NATO at one point, but it was blocked by Germany and France. Germany blocked it because it has entrenched oil interests with Russia. It's not about European security. Now, because they've seen the invasion of Ukraine, Finland and Sweden are now expediting their process to join NATO. NATO is growing because these countries fear the threat of Russian aggression. It's not Russia, and in Ukraine, Russia is not going to pull out if Ukraine has now promised it's not going to join NATO, and Russia is still continuing its invasion of Ukraine. It's not about that anymore. It's about Russia doesn't believe that Ukraine is an independent state. Putin has said this himself. He sees that Ukraine is part of a sort of greater Russia. This is a great Russian chauvinism. This is imperialism. This has more in common with the German expansionism across Europe in the 1930s. It's not going to be appeased by if we simply roll back the frontiers of NATO.
Well, I'll get more reaction from you throughout the show, James. After the break, we'll be discussing whether sex education should be taught to children, and also following riots in Sweden this week, we find out what is going on. And finally, is another working class revolt brewing in response to the cost of living crisis. But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Welcome back. Well, the Family Sex Show, a theatre show aimed at children as young as 5 that promised to reimagine sex education by discussing the issue in an open manner, has been cancelled after threats were made against its organisers. The show featured topics such as masturbation, gender and queerness, and includes frontal nudity of the adult actors. This created quite a backlash, to say the least, with many suggesting that the show could lead to inappropriate conversations between children and adults about sex and could even create a gap, quote, for predators to enter. Others, however, have pointed out that considering the audiences were given the full information necessary to make an informed decision before booking, cancelling it might actually have quite significant consequences for free speech and also be a missed opportunity to engage in discussions that young people are already having, but with this time having an educational purpose. Therefore, today we ask, what age is too young to be talking about sex? And is banning the show an attack on free speech or a necessary step to safeguard children? I'm really excited to be joined by Joe Bartosh, a freelance journalist, and Jordan Dixon, a clinical psychosexual and relationship psychotherapist. Thank you both for joining me. I'm going to start with you, Jordan. I mean, what's your thoughts on sex education for children? I think a lot of people worry that kids are just too young, or especially for this show, as young as 5. I mean, is that too young in your view?
So I think sex education is really important for children to take away what they need to know and make choices for themselves. I think from my personal understanding, 5 years is too young to talk about sexual pleasure potentially, but pleasure is an important aspect that children should know about. And I feel like young children should be taught about different ethnicities, different body types, different relationship styles and sexual orientations, and that's age appropriate.
I mean, but what do you say to those that, for most people, they never learnt about sex? It's just something that they figured out over time, and that you experiment, you figure it out for experience, and actually regimenting it in a way that a teacher teaches you actually takes some of the fun out of it. And why should kids be taught about it in that kind of academic, educational way when it's something to just experience?
That's a really interesting question. So I feel like it's really important for children to have knowledge so they can decide what they'd like to do to have enjoyable and safe, pleasurable experiences, or choose not to. You know, because my question is, what if we don't teach children about things like consent? What if we don't teach them about things like mutual pleasure? And I feel like there's a lot of people who do have, who I see come through the doors that do have their first sexual experiences are terrible. And, you know, by having that education, we can actually teach them things like the consequences and how to create enjoyable experiences and how sex works.
Really interesting. I mean, Joe, I'll come to you. I mean, what do you say to some of the things that Jordan has said? And some people will argue that we live in a culture that is pornified. You know, young kids are seeing pornographic imagery all the time, and perhaps the family sex show is an opportunity to have conversations about sex, but free from stigma, free from shame, in a really open way.
I think what we saw with the family sex show, it wasn't so much about education; it was about indoctrination. There was a very, very clear emphasis on a particularly sort of woke form of sex education. Now, I don't disagree that in principle sex education is important, not least because it can protect children and gives them the language that they need to explain if bad things happen to them. But I fail to see why exposing children to naked adult bodies on a stage is in reality any different to them being flashed at. I think it's totally unacceptable. It was very, very questionable that it was funded in the first place, and I don't think there's actually any need for it. It's the sort of thing that, in an age-appropriate way, kids can now be taught about, are now taught about, because sex education, relationships education is mandatory in schools. So I don't see any need for this show in particular.
Do you think about it being cancelled essentially because some of the organisers, you know, face threats and a backlash? Because ultimately, you know, it's the parents that are going to be taking their kids to that show. So the parents have made an informed decision, and surely they should be trusted to make decisions about what they think is right and appropriate for their own child. I mean, do you agree that it should be banned, or do you not think that parents can be trusted to make that decision?
I absolutely don't think it should have been banned. I just don't think it was suitable for children. So if adults want to go and see that, that's entirely up to them. I would question their judgment and perhaps suggest that their hard drives are checked. But I certainly wouldn't think that banning it per se is a good idea. It's just not suitable for children.
Do you think it is suitable then when it comes to young kids? I mean, what age do you think it is appropriate then to be having conversations or sex education in general?
I think discussions around boundaries can be had at quite a young age, explaining about different sorts of relationships. But there are age-appropriate ways to do that. And I think that the thing that was particularly concerning about the family sex show was that the emphasis was on pleasure, which in and of itself shouldn't be a problem. But frankly, if you need to be taught how to have a pleasurable experience as an adult, you're probably doing something wrong. And it's a totally inappropriate message to send out to children. Children, it's about, I suppose, the capacity to make those sort of decisions. children don't have that, and I feel like there's a blurring of boundaries, and there's a sort of a really lazy idea somehow that that boundaries are restrictive and they should be broken, and that shame is always a bad thing. Actually, sometimes shame serves a useful social purpose.
Last word to you, Jordan. I mean, I guess some of the organisers would say that, for example, trans children or kids with gender dysphoria or kids feeling thoughts about their sexuality and so on, this often happens very young, and that they want to introduce those kinds of conversations so that they feel comfortable knowing that, for example, there's not necessarily something wrong with them, or that there's not shame associated with being gay or having feelings for the same sex. And therefore, actually, in that context, kids as young as 5 might even just have those thoughts, and it could be okay to introduce them to those kinds of conversations.
See, I think it's really important to have conversations and for children to decide more critical conversations, and for children to decide what they want to do with that information. But if we don't have the conversations, they don't feel normal, and then they come through my door.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for discussing this subject. That was Jo Bartosz, freelance journalist, and Jordan Dixon in the studio with me, clinical psychosexual and relationship psychotherapist. Thank you both. Next, after riots broke out this week in Sweden, we find out why this is happening. And finally, is a working class revolt brewing in response to the cost of living crisis? But first, let's get the news.
Good afternoon, it's 3:33. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. 3 government ministers and 2 shadow cabinet ministers have been reported to a parliamentary watchdog for allegations of sexual misconduct. The Sunday Times reports they are among 56 MPs who've been referred to the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. The UK's Trade Policy Minister, Penny Mordaunt, has told GB News there's some indication the government's new immigration deal with Rwanda is already having a deterrent effect. The deal will see asylum seekers who cross the channel in small boats sent for processing in Rwanda, where they will have the right to apply to live. As Ukrainians try to celebrate Orthodox Easter Sunday, the governor of Luhansk has said a number of civilians have been killed by Russian shelling. In the Black Sea port Odessa, at least 8 people have been killed as 2 missiles struck 2 residential buildings. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister has urged the United Nations to step in and help agree a ceasefire in Mariupol and a humanitarian corridor. In Nigeria, more than 100 people were killed overnight in an explosion at an illegal oil refining depot. The State Commissioner for Petroleum Resources has said the fire outbreak occurred at an illegal bunkering site, and it affected over 100 people who were burnt beyond recognition. France is voting on its new president today. The country will decide whether pro-European Union President Emmanuel Macron keeps his job, or if so-called far-right candidate Marine Le Pen unseats him. And Tyson Fury has insisted it's time to hang up his boots after beating Dylan White to retain his WBC heavyweight world title at Wembley Stadium. Fury called it the perfect fight. He's adamant he'll now retire from the sport, saying he's fulfilled everything he ever wanted. You're up to date for now, but plenty more on all the main news stories at the top of the hour.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Just going to get some reaction from James Bloodworth, who's still with me in the studio, about our discussion just before the break, which was about whether sex education should be taught to kids as young as 5. What's your thoughts?
I mean, I have an issue with the age thing. I'm not sure 5-year-olds necessarily need to learn about sex. I mean, when I was 5, I was just learning to read the Beano. So the sex was the last thing on my mind. But I do think sex education is increasingly important where, in a kind of pornified society, I think it's more important to make sure that that young adults and sometimes young teenagers, not necessarily 5-year-olds, but young teenagers do get some form of sex education, so they're not getting that from pornography, because I think there are many harmful trends there that they could pick up.
I guess some of the reason why it seems that a lot of people were in uproar about this particular show is because we're embedded in a wider societal question about the politicisation of sex and gender, and people feel that there is almost a kind of agenda, what Joe was saying, indoctrination, in order to socialise kids into certain sexual values. And I think there's anxiety around that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think around the trans debate, for example, that's become very politicised. So you have two sides which are unwilling to almost compromise with each other. And I wouldn't like to see that politicisation go into schools and impact on children. I do, however, think that it's important for children at some point to learn about sexuality, because there are a range of sexualities. It's not just heterosexual. Because I remember when I was at school, gay was often used as an insult to other kids, and I think that's
a good point.
Very negative.
And that could happen actually in primary school still.
Yeah, so I think there's a difference between learning about kind of orientations and learning about sex itself. So I think it's at some point children should learn that some kids are gay. Get over it. That's fine. So it's not used as kind of a put down or insult to kids who aren't who don't conform to the norm in that way.
We'll get more reaction from you as the show goes on. Well, in France, far-right leader Marine Le Pen managed to distance her rival Eric Zemmour in the polls and is eyeing the second round of the presidential election. French people are going to the polls today. Other countries in Europe and the US have also seen a surge in right-wing populism, Brexit in the UK, the election of Viktor Orban in Hungary, Trump's presidential term in the US. These events have thrown into relief how wide the gap is between elite concerns heavily imprinted in identity politics and the concerns of the majority, mainly to do with their material conditions. Soaring energy, food and housing costs, social mobility is stagnating all across the world, and resentment is clearly building as a result. But populist voters are still being dismissed as bigots. Today we ask, what will it take for the governing classes to finally take the concerns of the majority seriously? And is another populist backlash brewing? Well, let's get more on this by Eric Proxer, a research fellow at Harvard's Growth Lab and author and journalist. Thank you for joining me. I mean, what do you think? Do you think a populist revolt is brewing? Are you worried about some of the rise in right-wing populism across the world, or do you see this as perhaps a legitimate expression of resentment and a backlash against the elite?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite clear that this is a long, ongoing trend. This is something where you can observe loss of confidence in government, rising political polarization, rising dissatisfaction with the status quo for the last 20, 30 odd years. Now, in my new book, Reclaiming Populism, How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters, co-authored with Paul Somerville, we make the very clear point that the mainstream response to this problem has been, in fact, quite tragic because these voters do have legitimate economic grievances. There's declining social mobility. There's worsening economic fairness, the sense that no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be rewarded according to your talent and effort. That creates an unfair system. The tragedy is that if this was fixed, people could create a more just society and people could, bolster confidence in liberal democracy. But if you leave this problem to stew and you dismiss those kinds of concerns whenever somebody raises them as simply, bigotry or stupidity, whatever you want to label it, then it's going to boil over and you're going to get something eventually like the rise of Donald Trump in the US, where there can be genuine threats to democracy.
I mean, what could be done about this? I mean, what do you think? We need a radical policy proposal response, or do you just think that we need to have political leaders listen to the population more? I mean, what's your suggestion about how we really change this?
Well, there's two categories of things that need to be done differently. One is with regard to politics, and one is with regard to policy. So first of all, with regard to politics, we need to get past this moment of thinking of huge swaths of the electorate as deplorables and bigots and what have you. We need to start taking their concerns seriously and listen to what they have to say, because if we don't do that, we're never going to understand their concerns. The second issue is with policy. Policy has really messed up the response to this, in part because it's framed by this big government, small government dichotomy, where people think either that, the government should do as much as possible or as little as possible. We argue very strongly in our book that, in fact, to construct a more socially mobile and fairer state, there needs to be strong government intervention to support equal opportunity through things like education and housing and transport infrastructure, but also twinning that with competitive markets that create fair rewards for people so that there are plenty of good jobs, plenty of good wages, plenty of employment, so that people can really make their way up the income ladder.
Do you think that political elites in America and also in the UK and elsewhere are actually listening to the message that you are advocating for? I mean, that message to some extent was partly embodied in some of the policies of Bernie Sanders, but also Donald Trump. But there seems to have been perhaps a move back to the status quo. I mean, do you think that there is, the political elites are now more receptive, having seen the populist backlash over the last few years?
Well, I think that some politicians are perhaps starting to listen more to the kinds of populist voters. And we see, for example, Keir Starmer arguably is perhaps listening to regular people more than Jeremy Corbyn, at least. You can see some trends in places like the US and Canada, where there's a resurgence of a middle ground that tries to take voters seriously. But by and large, there is a lack of comprehension that, to fix these kinds of problems of low social mobility in society, it's not about eliminating the possibility of success through aggressive redistribution. It's about making success fair again. That requires government intervention for equal opportunity, not equalizing outcomes. And there's a lack of recognition about that very, very sorely.
And also, how do you think we've got to this point? I mean, was it just inevitable? Did our political leaders get complacent? I mean, why do you think that we've got to a point where there does seem to be just such a huge disconnect?
Well, it's because there are a pool of policy failures. It differs depending on the country, and you can trace these back decades that have inhibited economic fairness, that have prevented people from getting ahead on their own talent and effort. You can think of places like the United States and arguably even to an extent the United Kingdom, where there's been, say, insufficient investment in infrastructure and transport in British regions, or the unaffordability of healthcare and education in the US that have left citizens very deeply unequipped to deal with major changes in the global economy, like globalization, like the global financial crisis, where there's just been a lack of equal opportunity, a lack of opportunity. But at the same time, you have countries like especially France, arguably also Italy, that are on the opposite side of the spectrum. They go too far in the direction of too much government intervention and try to equalize outcomes. You have situations where there are barbers in Paris that have to perform 200 haircuts a month just to pay what they owe the state in taxes and social security contributions before earning any take-home pay. And it's not difficult to imagine how that can hobble the life chances of somebody trying to work their way up the income ladder. So it's this pools of policy failures going back decades.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Eric Prox, a research fellow at Harvard's Growth Lab. Thank you so much. Now, we'll just get some reaction from you, James, to what Eric said. I mean, do you think that we still have this problem of a growing disconnect between political elites and ordinary people?
Yes, I do. I think for many years, the centre-left parties in Europe and the United States took working-class voters for granted. So the Labour Party in this country, they assumed, the so-called red wall seats, they assumed that working-class voters in those areas would automatically vote Labour because they had nowhere else to go. I think that's been a problem. The commentator just then mentioned the word deplorables. I mean, Hillary Clinton famously dismissed many working-class voters as deplorables, and I think that was part of what cost her the election. The irony, though, I would say, is that populist right movements often don't have the radical answers that working people would help working people.
What about populist left?
Well, I mean, we haven't seen many successful populist left movements emerge yet. Jeremy Corbyn, you could say, was an attempt at that. But again, Jeremy Corbyn himself and his movement, they seem to be much more fixated on identity politics and foreign policy issues. In this country at the moment, Rishi Sunak is the Chancellor. He owns, I think, 4 houses and spends probably more heating one of his swimming pools a year than most people can pay for their gas and electricity bills. And it doesn't look like there are any radical economic policies on the agenda from the populist right government in this country. So,
but do you think Keir Starmer has the answers either?
I think there is, as was mentioned there, I think there's more engagement with working class voters. There's more, there's more of a sense of what's going on in those communities. So you do see some kind of movement on cultural issues, more understanding of cultural conservatives in some of those seats. But I think Labour hasn't really set out its stall yet in terms of the economy because it's too far out from a general election. So it's kind of, we don't really know at this point. I think opposing the national insurance rise in itself is a good policy because I think that will hit working people again on top of the inflationary pressure and the rise in energy costs.
And just finally, I mean, Marine Le Pen is doing, even if she loses, way better than she did a few years ago. I mean, do you worry that if this issue isn't sorted or if this connect isn't brought together, that we are going to see more people like her?
Absolutely. I think the rise of Marine Le Pen, and I don't think she'll win the election, but she will push Macron close. I think that again reflects the disillusionment many people feel with political elites across Europe. Macron is an establishment centrist, and he hasn't delivered for people. Many people are just voting for him just out of detestation for Marine Le Pen, not because they actually are enthusiastic about Macron and his policies.
Well, in another story, in the UK, when we think of Sweden, we often think of a society with extraordinarily high levels of social trust, social and economic development, with a generous welfare state. However, this week, dozens of people were arrested in Sweden after violent clashes between the police and people ensued following plans from a far-right group to burn the Quran. The violence erupted after a series of rallies were organised by the Danish-Swedish anti-Islam politician Rasmus Paludan. The Quran, as many people know, is Islam's holy book, and for some Muslims, intentional damage or disrespect towards it is highly offensive. Although Swedish police state that the violent protests are linked to criminal gangs. In recent years, Sweden has faced a growing problem of violent criminal gangs, with in 2021 seeing over 100 incidents of bombing and explosions. This problem actually led Germany's biggest newspaper, Bild, to recently dub Sweden as Europe's most dangerous country. Therefore, on the discussion this week, we asked what is going on in Sweden. Joining me now to discuss this is journalist Eva RP. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I mean, could you just give us a quick summary of what's happened in Sweden over the last week?
So the igniting spark was that this Danish politician Rasmus Paludan, as you stated, he visited Sweden as on a tour, so to speak, of burning the Quran in what we in Sweden call they're basically ghettos, or they are areas where they're overwhelmingly Muslim and immigrant, and so he wanted to go to a lot of these places in different Swedish cities and burn the Quran. And because he got allowed to do that, because it's the law, Swedish law, that you are allowed to do that, then a lot of protest was staged, and what seems to have been pretty organized in some areas. by criminal gangs, and but not just criminal gangs. There were also young kids, older women, and people joining from the sidelines. So the riots have been pretty extensive, and he didn't even show up to a lot of these areas. So it basically became a showdown between criminals and citizens of these areas and the police. So and I'm afraid that the police lost many of these conflicts. So it was a very scary moment for a lot of these police officers. They weren't ready for the situation that they were bussed into.
But one thing about the police, which has actually been quite striking in Sweden, police chiefs have been notably principled on the matter, stating that people in Sweden must be free to use their constitutional protected rights to express their opinion and to demonstrate. So, I mean, do you think that, burning the Quran is an example of freedom of expression?
Yes, of course. I mean, I just spoke to an Arab Swedish atheist, Omar Makram, on my podcast, and he burnt the Quran as a way to show that he had left Islam, and so he was granted asylum in Sweden because he burned the Quran, and so he fled Egypt because he couldn't be an ex-Muslim in Egypt, and now he fears for his life here in Sweden because he's received a lot of threats in connection to this. So, of course, it's part of the freedom of speech and the right to express whatever opinion you might have. If it's Islamist, if it's right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism, you should be allowed to do that. But now the police is not granting Rasmus Paludan the right to demonstrate again in Borås in Sweden because he's a disturber of the peace, so to speak. And so we're already facing challenges to the freedom of speech because, as it's been shown now, if you are enough people and you're violent enough and you're angry enough, then you can curtail the freedoms that we should be able to enjoy in Sweden.
But on a wider point, Sweden, as I mentioned in the introduction, is facing a growing problem. In 2021 alone, over 100 incidents of bombing and explosions. It does seem this particular phenomenon does seem to be particularly a problem in Sweden, with Germany, as I said, mentioning it as potentially the most dangerous country in Europe. I mean, why is this happening, and what is being done to tackle what seems to be a growing problem of the consequences of ghettoization in Sweden?
Yeah, it's been a problem really for the last 30 years, and it's been deepening and deepening. And the people who have warned of this said that we need less immigration so that we have the ability to integrate these people who are coming in and who are moving to these problem-ridden areas. And they were largely ignored or shunned or pushed out of politics and labeled as racists or populists or to that effect. So what we've had is we've had Europe's highest immigration for a long time, if you look at per capita, and we have not done enough to integrate these people. But even if you want to integrate into Swedish society, if you live in one of these areas, you don't have Swedish speakers and majority Swedes as neighbors. So you're sort of stuck in these areas to a large degree, and that wasn't the case 30 years ago. Then you moved to these areas, and then you moved away when you got a job So the earlier waves of immigration in Sweden have integrated somewhat better. But now we have the ghettoization, and I'm not sure if there's any policy that can tackle this there's no silver bullet, so to speak.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, journalist Eva RP, and hopefully we'll bring you more as this story develops. Just quick reaction from you, James, about what's going on in Sweden.
I mean, it's a worrying situation. I mean, I think burning the Quran is free expression, although at the same time, I think it's a horrible thing to do. It's like I wouldn't condone that. But I think it's important to stand up for the principle of free expression. I don't think it justifies, I mean, it's obviously a provocation, someone from the far right doing this, but it doesn't justify riots and bombings, etc.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the programme. That's all from us on the discussion. Join me at the same time next week. But up next is Nana Queer.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking fine and sunny for many, though a few showers for northern England. Let's take a look at the details. In the southeast, a few showers around over the Isles of Scilly, otherwise it should be dry with some sunshine to end the day. Meanwhile, over the southeast and around London, there will be very little, if any, cloud. Temperatures will be in the mid-teens. For Wales, it will be a fine evening with plenty of late sunshine. There'll be a few late showers for parts of northwest England, and these may also clip parts of the West Midlands too. These are going to die out through the evening. Towards the northeast coast, there will be some murky low cloud feeding in on the onshore breeze. Further inland, things could stay fine with some sunshine lingering to end the day. 1 or 2 showers are possible for southern and southwestern parts of Scotland later. Otherwise, it will be a dry evening with variable amounts of cloud and sunny breaks. Across in Northern Ireland, it will be fine to end the day with plenty of late sunshine. The brisk breeze should have eased as well with light winds tonight. Looking ahead at the UK overnight, and any showers will die out with a touch of frost in rural northern spots. And that's how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like